In many ways, Chicago is an excellent case study for treaties between native nations and the U.S. government. The treaties made about this land vary greatly in the conditions under which they were negotiated and the tactics U.S. officials used to get them signed.
This is a speech made by Myaamia leader Mihšihkinaahkwa, or Little Turtle, at the 1795 Treaty of Greenville negotiations, the first of 4 treaties that ceded land in Chicago. The other 3 treaties that ceded land here are the 1816 Treaty of St. Louis, the 1829 Treaty of Prairie to Chien, and the 1832 Treaty of Tippecanoe. Each of the materials on this wall represents one of those treaties. To understand the complicated nature of these land cessions, we first have to understand what a treaty is. A treaty is a nation-to-nation agreement that defines mutual obligations between parties, in this case, Indigenous nations and the United States of America. For Indigenous people who had long-standing practices for recognizing territorial boundaries that predate colonization, these were seen as agreements that had the potential to create respectful and mutually beneficial relationships. But settlers did not recognize Indigenous legal systems as valid. They saw treaties as transactional and used a variety of strategies to secure land that were not based in respect and reciprocity. Doug Keel, citizen of the Oneida Nation, associate professor of history at Northwestern, and co-curator of the Indigenous Chicago exhibition.
The treaties that ceded land in Chicago give us a few good examples of these tactics. First, many treaty negotiations began on unequal footing. The U.S. government frequently called tribes to negotiations after enacting violence against our communities, or when tribes were in dire need of supplies. Such was the case in the 1795 Treaty of Greenville, which ended a conflict known as the Northwest Indian War, and in the 1816 Treaty of St. Louis, which U.S. officials strategically scheduled at a time when Anishinaabe communities needed support. Once treaty negotiations began, U.S. treaty commissioners aggressively sought the signatures of Native leaders, and when they could not acquire the signatures they desired, they went to other leaders, or even entirely different communities. As a result, many tribal nations contested treaties that they believed were signed by unauthorized individuals. This is what happened in the 1795 Treaty of Greenville. Anishinaabe leaders who lived at Chicago protested the treaty, arguing that the Anishinaabe who signed the agreement were not from Chicago and did not have the authority to cede the land there.
In addition to the 4 treaties that ceded land in Chicago, 2 treaty negotiations were held at Chicago, but did not cede land there. The 1821 Treaty of Chicago ceded land in present-day Michigan and Indiana, and the 1833 Treaty of Chicago ceded land in present-day northern Illinois and Wisconsin.
These 2 treaty councils held at Chicago give us more examples of the U.S. government's tactics. Treaty commissioners often intentionally held negotiations far away from the lands that were to be ceded. Because treaty talks typically occurred over several weeks, and entire communities traveled to attend them, this exhausted the resources of communities that were required for these long journeys and made them more likely to need the payments and supplies offered. U.S. officials also used the threat of violence to convince Native leaders to attend treaty talks and cede land. This is what happened after the Bad Axe Massacre at the end of the 1832 Black Hawk War. During negotiations for the 1833 Treaty of Chicago, American officials suggested that the Anishinaabe might experience similarly violent outcomes if they did not relinquish their final land claims and remove themselves from their homelands. These treaties and many others were fundamentally unfair agreements, but it's too simple to say that our ancestors had no idea what they were signing. Native leaders had well-established practices of diplomacy across language barriers, and many worked hard to retain certain rights to things like hunting and fishing, and secure things like education for our communities. In many cases, they made difficult decisions that considered both the interests of their relatives at the time of signing as well as those of future generations. Though many treaties were broken, the rights guaranteed in these agreements and the inherent sovereignty of our nations persist to this day.